Hello everyone, today we talk about the dreamlike relics of the Central Asian Oceanic Horde being won by combat in an 18th century context, right, where Western forces, but also Central European, Eastern Balkan ones, confronted each other at early summer video in the typical Schwerpunkt style that we will surely be expanding on at some point because of modern warfare. I can tell you that I've had today the chance to receive the news that my little piece, which is not an article because otherwise I would have had to provide name, surname, etc. And I'm not a modernist, but an Italian publishing house contacted me months ago and told me, look, we like your channel, we can't sponsor you because this is a publicly funded military history journal, but we can find a little corner for you as a sort of retail next to the articles for, sensitizing people to this kind of content. And there are other, I haven't checked the volume yet, but I'm there, of course, with other figures. And that, incidentally, has a lot to do with what we're discussing today, because being for a modern warfare volume, I published essentially in English, so you will actually take a look at it. And again, it's not, I will give you the link at some point, it's not really, again, an article. That's not essentially how I would write. It's basically a prose version of Schwerpunkts. In fact, there are no notes, nothing. It's just like, look, this is my channel, we discuss this, etc. But since it's for modern warfare military history journal, or at least it's modern warfare section, I could contribute, by the way, to other, of course, to the medieval one at some point. Well, I have to see, because I have different articles underway for other journals. It's a much more serious way, and not as Schwerpunkt, by the way, of course, my real persona out there. So we'll see. But it's an interesting start, because in there I reflected, mostly said, what can I say? I'm a medievalist. I'm not really an academic expert, at least one that publishes and has properly an historiographical access, let's say, to what would make like a proper modern warfare analysis by peer-reviewed standards. Of course, I'm not scared. I would be able to do something like that as well. But in the moment, it was an opportunity offered to me just as a YouTube channel to sponsor myself, at least within the confines in there of Italian law regarding stattal funding to this kind of initiatives. And I decided to dedicate that piece to the criticism that I often do to the sort of modernistic, secularistic perspective that we tend to have whenever we talk about, say, the Renaissance onward, right? Stressing the traditional religious, imperial, whatever you want to call them, continuity, well, through phases that have been sort of publicized, sponsored as, the military revolution, right, or this kind of things, like the advancements of technology or whatever, forgetting in many ways what really motivated those who went at war in these times. How much I spared like a broad. I talked also about the notion that indeed when we look at medieval states, we see them continuing throughout the modern age, right? You have really to await the contemporary period, so the last couple of 100 years, more or less, to really have a more centralized state that takes off. And it's not, again, just per se, just the measure, in fact, of the forgetfulness towards tradition. It's rather the fact that mass society, of course, broke loose the sort of the deterior, like the lowest element of the masses, and of course improved in part some of their at least absolute condition, but that also tended to present narratives that, as far as modern warfare goes, seem to be absolutely inadequate, in especially a proper academic description of the same. in the narrative, in the rhetoric, in the vocabulary, in much more. So I will give you the link to that stuff. Today we talk the Battle of Peterwardein. That is one of the most fascinating and important of the early 18th century. I will, if I get my computer back, not mostly for a psychological problem, I could do it even from tomorrow, but let's say I planned lots of different stuff. The disk fortunately will be saved, etc. But I want to go back, go back on track, especially for an explosive September or something like that regarding these topics. And surely Peterwardein would be a great topic for standalone battle analysis. But I want to resume properly the Prince Eugene series that I started years ago. Many of you are completely unaware of that, but that is also where Schwerpunkt prepotently comes from in terms of what kind of political, military, cultural models are we taking into consideration. And indeed, there is a detail, if anything, that we can extrapolate from one of the sources about the Battle of Peterwardein, 1716, that really illustrate how close that literal Middle Ages was still to 18th century warfare, at least in the vestiges, in the symbols, in the whole conception of warfare. And definitely, I don't know how far we're going to go with this today. It's not something that can simply be addressed so simply. It requires tens of videos, but we'll try our best, if anything, to introduce the context that in and of itself is extraordinary. And we'll get to it in a minute, because it's something you can literally see with your eyes today from those times and before in that way. So it's obvious that the 18th century, as I explained, in having created, just by that, having created a linear tactics playlist, was marked a transformative shift in European warfare. But it was accompanied in this by some much bigger and still fundamentally universal understanding of the Western role in the world. Right, and in this, unavoidably, if we consider especially modern warfare, this had to do with the same change in the European perception of the Ottoman Empire. I really want to start a series about the Turkish wars, like something very introductory, but covering at least some topics and campaigns, battles that we will have, again, to go into, as always. I say always the same thing. We'll get more in depth, that we will dedicate a single video to it. This is exactly how I'm structuring the content. So it may be sort of boring to say, but rather than spoiling, saying things like, I don't know, putting sponsors in the video, which I don't, constantly repeating to subscribe or other BS, like I'm actually at least just reminding you that everything is available out there, and most of you literally do not have an idea of the scale of the stuff I discussed already in this topic, and therefore where I come from with this, by the way, with my intuitions and more. All right. And the 18th century is such a beautiful century, telling the truth. Regardless, again, there is always a good and a bad side for everything, but you always admire life in its forms. And the attitude towards the Ottoman Empire in the West was at this point driven within this shift by, for example, a potent mix of exoticism, Enlightenment ideals of tolerance, so actually not the good reasons, telling the truth, critiques of religious fanaticism, which only to some extent you can subscribe to, because it really depends which kind of religious fanaticism. Because in this case, it was rather saying, oh, look, the Ottomans were not actually all that bad, and we terrible Christians. That's the beginning of the self-sabotage that the masses began to do, because they couldn't afford to be like, the great regime that was, however, also losing pieces along the way. And so it was a collective defeat. And actually, the same is true for the Ottomans as well. I mean, part of this psychological attitude derived from the fact that the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. There is a sort of international realignment, as you know. That was not to be given for granted, but that indeed entailed, in particular, the Ottoman Empire's waning military threat in the Balkans after pivotal defeats like the Battle of Peterwardein in 1716. I don't remember when we stopped our series about Prince Eugene. We will have to restart it completely. I recently made a video about him, but it's not part of the series. And there are marvels like Zenta, Belgrade. Those are masterpieces in the art of war. I mean, if you don't know that, it's like, I don't know, not knowing the campaigns fought between Montecuccolo and Turenne. We are at levels of military glory and sort of firmament achievement that objectively should be the discriminant of those who can afford to vote in the West. I mean, if you don't know these things, you're not a Westerner by definition. You have literally nothing to do with the West. Doesn't matter where you were born, what you look like, what language you speak. If you don't know these chapters of military history, you're just out, and you should be out for that matter. With everybody else, of course, that doesn't even care to begin with. But I will be honest here, I never considered myself stratospherically cultured person. I mean, of course, I spent my years, studying and educating yourself. You learn stuff, but it's not like I'm a genius or I know everything or whatever. But there is a bare minimum of, say, cultural background that gives you an idea of how, in fact, it's not much that you are sort of elevated from the masses. It's just that the masses that are so horrifyingly sunken in their own total, complete abyss of ignorance that it doesn't take literally anything to be a cultured person compared to this lesser people. And this is actually the only comfort that derives sometimes from this kind of profession, when you are actually confronted with the literal scale of complete oblivion you're surrounded by. Now, going back to our 18th century picture, right? So sort of our Turquerie. The Ottoman administrative system is peculiar. We described it sometimes, characterized by the devshirme, for example, as far as the meritocratic recruitment of non-Muslims into elite military and bureaucratic roles. Its multi-ethnic governance was frequently idealized as a discipline alternative to what appeared only as the hereditary chaos of Europe's ancien regime in times of increasing tension with the Third Estate, the expansion of a public opinion, the increasing capacity of the industrials to mobilize masses of the Fourth Estaters in attemptively revolutionary directions. Of course, everything progressed very gradually in this direction. But indeed, the Ottomans were started to be taken, especially as their power was redimensioned. I mean, I just may started, as you know, this year a series about the Crimean War. That's literally the moment in which, up to the few decades before, like, the Ottomans were still seen as the bad Islamic Turks that you had to kick in the butt and whatever. And then they became allies because, objectively, like, they were needed against the Tsarist Empire, that was also, in fact, butt-kicked in the process by the same Turks, by the way, that behaved much better in relative terms to the Russian troops. But aside from that, of course, in the 18th century, the Ottoman card had already started being wavered. And by the way, think about Mozart, think about the literal Austrian reality. This, of course, in the later 18th century, because in the beginning, there was, as we will see now, a much different reality. But look at these Turks, they're kind of our friends. It's basically our modern mentality, our way of alleged mind openness, which does not mean tolerance, but that we still basically voice as ignorant people when we say, but, no, don't worry, Islam, there is also the moderate Islam, or at least there is just the one that you can see somewhere by some people at the top that understand, of course, that being underdeveloped third world or constantly paralyzed by inferiority complexes, has nothing to do really with, with the majority. Well, yeah, exactly. There is much more, of course, in terms of objective admiration of what was the Ottoman Empire from a historical, political, military point of view. I mean, I myself, of course, could never enjoy the Turkish wars and the same Habsburgic victories over the Ottomans if I didn't think that the Turk was a formidable enemy. And this is what also modern people tend to schismatically and dichotomically, when not literally schizophrenically, behave like, right? Either you love everything about something or you hate everything about something, because the bottom line is that you literally do not know anything about that something. And this is how people go. Like today, I've literally met people who said, in order to understand really the culture of people, you must go on vacations there. Yeah, sure. You're with a post-socialist education. You will take a discounted 1 week vacation in, I don't know, in Iran. You will be lectured by a guy that doesn't even have maybe a bachelor degree in second world garbage sewer. You will wear a veil so that you enter sort of the deep tradition of this millenary people, this military culture, and you will come back to Europe and say, oh no, but I was there, so I really understand, what this culture really was. The point is if you don't get kicked in the teeth by a boot, you could not even have the right to speak if I were in charge, probably. But the problem is that we're really looking back at those times where the concept of authority, discipline, a sense of manhood, of virility, of rigidity, right? A sense that you would go out there armed, shooting at those who were to invade your land, and you were to burn them alive when captured. That together with the smell of the burning flesh and the shouts of the dying person, like, would really confer you that aura of charisma, together with a bit of ash and smoked human fat on your clothing. That's the kind of spirit we really want to enter here. Like what it means to assess, first of all, from a historical, from a strategical, from a cultural point of view, because there is a radical hierarchy of objectivity that has nothing to do with what the subjective opinion is, and that you can build only by spitting blood and sweating tears for decades of if not your entire life, just to understand a tiny minimum of what this whole thing actually was, right? And that's also part of the reason why I try to learn history from my perspective, my standards, in a too sort of comfortable way, in the way I should actually learn it, day by day. And so there is no doubt that the rhetoric that look at these other cultures, like it's basically what they told you in the 60s, in the 70s. The Easterners, like they really understand everything. In the West, we're in the midst of skyscrapers, of cars. Everything is noisy. We don't have an internal peace and balance anymore. I don't know. I went over to India to meditate, and it changed my life. Buddhism. Yeah, that's the same identical thing, except in the 18th century, people were sort of a bit less subhuman than today. And they understood at least that there was some sensual, because this is, at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's a Pelasgian mythology. It's the civilization of the Great Mother. We've seen it in other videos as well. That, looking at Turkey, looking at Mediterranean, the broader sort of Levantine side, definitely attracts you. Like if you want to go there on vacations, I've never been out of. I've always been just in civilized countries for according to my standards. Never set foot into Turkey. If I am going to do that, it's because I will retake Constantinople together with my proud followers at some point, and I refuse, as always, to use the other name, right? But it's indeed part of the same European culture and identity to own such silly romanticized view, at least for those who are more distant from the theaters involved here, at least the more spoiled, the more above, the same at that point emasculated Ottoman threat. This view is amplified, for example, by the travelogues of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's Turkish embassy letters. The date actually to very close times to the ones we're describing today, which is literally 1717, 1718, which, by the way, tells you also what kind of perspective existed from different countries. Like, Wortley Montagu was, née Pierrepont, was an English aristocrat, and she was naturally, like, in that Western perspective with the British, not quite taking off completely, because it would take like another couple of generations for Britain to become literally the greatest power in the world after China at that point. It was 7 years war, basically. And also made videos about that. But it's indeed one of those powers that had always not given a blip about the Turkish world, just like today, right? And that's why you say we must recover the Central European and Middle European perspective. We have to recover, the Italian perspective. We have to recover the Balkan, the Danubian perspective, because indeed, if you stick to already, like, Lady Montagu's letters are actually very, very beautiful. They date back to a real context that, of course, tells us much about how it was really, literally just in the same year of the Battle of Peterwardein. But again, from a country that had at some point preferred to sabotage the same Catholic enterprise against the Turks, because after all, from our side of the aisle, we were just a bunch of dirty papists, weren't we? Right? Or still are to a degree. Well, no, because suddenly nobody remembers what religion even is. In such places. But that's, in fact, the worst part of it all. And I would say that looking back at these times can help easily recover the only path, right? This is not a struggle between people who basically think that religion is, one religion is good like another, versus people who are religious. This is literally, being there only one religion in your entire traditional history, and you deciding to stop to remembering everything about it just because, right? It's too much to learn history and literally the ABC of it, right? The aforementioned letters, by the way, offered vivid accounts of Ottoman social customs, particularly the relative autonomy of women in the harem, which was something that, again, excited mostly the fantasies of everybody involved. Challenging in that sense, even in a pretty horrifying way. The European sexual norms, there are people who say gender norm. No, it's called sex, right? Gender is things, like you attribute, in fact, a sexual character, a fictitious sexual character, to objects, and that's in fact what sex is not, that is fictitious or opinable, and presenting the Ottoman Empire as a site of cultural sophistication. And in fact, it was a pile of BS, because the Ottoman Empire was, yes, grandiose in some ways, in historical legacy and more, but of course it was, compared to the West, a pretty obscure place under every aspect involved. And of course, if you look at the elites, that's another story. Indeed, the harem at the Ottoman court was, at least by look, much more splendid than many Western brothels. But it had also a higher meaning of that, but we're talking about the Sultan's palace, and so it's something a bit obviously sophisticated compared to what was the reality of the Turkish world. Now, these accounts dovetailed with the growing European fascination with the Turquerie, which was not singular or alone. The same was present for Persia, for China, as these countries were being increasingly rediscovered, in a sense, at least through a transoceanic context, facilitating global communication. And so the Turquerie is to be found in many aspects as a vogue for Ottoman-inspired art, fashion, and architecture, evident in everything from Parisian salons adorned with Turkish carpets to the elaborate costumes of masquerade balls. The taste for the exotic, broadly meant, right? The Ottoman Empire was not less distant than, I don't know, Poland, right? You have some portrait of Louis XIV dressed in a traditional Polish costume that looks as, sort of strange as it could be like an Ottoman one to some degree. It was heavily informed by Western styles. Think about Suleiman, sort of matriarch type of multiple set of crowns. So that had always been a thing, and we will see it better in another video. But what is more fascinating is how certain countries increasingly modernizing and secularizing, breaking free from the idea that there was a traditional sort of dimension from which they had emerged, namely France, England, even from very different backgrounds, but definitely the ones that would in fact lead that modernization and secularization, colonial, industrial powers, and so on. Here it's early 18th century, still an incredibly archaic and primitive time, but still that mentality is somehow there. And interestingly enough, especially in France, this stems from actually a universal ideal of France herself, an imperial one that, as we've seen, had been sort of cultivated since the Middle Ages, except there was also Holy Roman Empire that would have said something concerning the formalities. Nevertheless, economically, the Ottoman Empire's integration into European trade networks further softened its image as a distant menace. Ports like Izmir and Salonika facilitated the flow of coffee, silk, and spices, with coffee houses in London, Paris, and the same Vienna becoming hubs for Enlightenment debate, often decorated with turquerie motifs that symbolize cosmopolitanism. Think about the crescent-shaped, in fact, croissant that became like a famous suite, but in the same Vienna, remembering the crescent of the Ottoman flags captured after the glorious break of the siege of 1683, to which we dedicated a vast amount of content on Schwerpunkt, that therefore could be, as it often happens historically, exercised in the terror, in the memory of those terrible days, through just like, now we eat your same crescent. And the crescent is a symbol that, as you know, belongs to tradition from millennia. It has a very specific meaning we described in recent videos, also and especially in the Catholic tradition, where properly that lunar aspect is won by the same soul of chivalry, the Virgin, that is the transfigured soul of the victorious hero, just like the Polish hussars that ran over the Janissaries in front of the gates of Vienna. These economic ties we're discussing, coupled with the empire's role as a buffer against Tsarist expansion, and only at that point, speaking of external realities, like Russia at this point was barely connected with the rest of Europe. It's not until, in fact, Peter the Great in these years that there is also, through a very specific and macroscopic process of westernization, right, or better, of reupdatement of what is actually European Russia to the higher standards of the West, that you can start speaking of this country as part of the broader international situation in a meaningful way. And therefore, as we said also before regarding the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire was becoming increasingly, due to its position as a pragmatic partner in European international relations. This is true as early as after the 1718 Treaty of Passarobitz, which normalized diplomatic relations. Naturally, things were still complicated. As you know, much would actually happen within the Ottoman Empire to set a specific trend of weakness and sort of further decline. But one that, in fact, Europeans began to become wary of in the eventuality of a sudden collapse of the same Ottoman Empire that would have conferred a disproportionate power to whoever would have in fact controlled the straits. So it was better to actually prop the empire up, because in a way, by trade it was already conquered, and you could avoid somebody else taking Constantinople and creating much greater problems to the international balance, not just the continental one. Naturally, again, in 1716, 1718, this was already thought and was already understood, but there were also much bigger games at play. In a broader cultural sense, like the presence of Ottoman ambassadors in European courts described in diplomatic correspondence as both exotic and dignified further bridged cultural divides, as did the work of Ottoman scholars and translators who introduced Arabic and Persian texts to European intellectuals on some occasions. Not that, again, Europe needed quite much that to go on by itself. That was true since the Renaissance. The myth that, humanism was triggered by some Byzantine refugees fleeing from the Turks is heavily debunked by all Byzantinistics by quite a long time. The West was disproportionately more advanced at this point. You can argue, say, being more advanced doesn't necessarily mean not... you can see easy comparisons today. Like, that doesn't mean that there isn't a threat out there. But the Ottoman Empire had evidently began sort of losing the game. And also for obvious reasons. I mean, they were often at war on three contemporary fronts, right? Ukraine, Hungary, Mesopotamia. So it's not really like this empire had infinite resources. It had been born over a system like it was the fact of the Byzantine Empire that had already not been competitive towards the West for a very long time. And the Ottomans barely sort of re-injected enough power just to indeed clamorously re-expand this power, exploiting the same European divides, but also not being able to simply remain at pace with European growth. A divide you can start sort of seeing clearly at this point, where really from the battlefield itself, the Ottoman forces could sort of barely stand the civilizational ground, not meaning the literal line, but in many ways that was felt as a moral preponderance, considering especially this was basically carried out just by Austria, Venice, and a few other powers alone. And again, England or France could simply watch this from the distance. In the Enlightenment, though, thus, the figure of the Turk joined Chinese and Persian archetypes in pseudo-orientalistic discourses that served as mirrors for European self-critique. Anthropology was not quite there yet. There are some very strange ways, indeed, in which, like, the Turks, the Chinese, and the Persians were depicted at the time. Because, literally, it's not like there was any specific interest to understand these cultures well for what they really were. In many ways, they could simply be used as fidgets to say, okay, well, let's like masks, right, of comedy or some sort of more philosophical idea. Voltaire, while denouncing Muhammad's fanaticism in Mahomet, 1741, used Ottoman settings to explore rational governance in the Catechisme du Jardinier, set on Ottoman-occupied Samos. Naturally, Voltaire was exactly one of those perfect hypocrites that tried to self-sabotage the system in all ways, siding with enemies of his country, attacking Catholicism, and canceling any mention of Protestant crimes or fanaticism. And so he has this strange attitude, also incoherent attitude towards the Turks, meaning like this is Islam, right? What you want, like don't they follow the Quran? Isn't the entire foundation rotten in many ways? So it's always like today's lefties, right? From one side, welcome refugees and whatever, and then, but no, the woman must be respected. So have you read the Quran? Okay, do you realize what that entails? Regardless of whether this is right or wrong, whatever, but do you realize how incoherent your entire position and it's complete denial? And it does stem from radical ignorance, from cultural inferiority, from undereducation, from a very heavy moral, personal, cultural deficit that people should highlight. Let's be honest. Like the average person, as it emerged from the last generations in general, this is, yes, it can be for the liberals or the conservatives, they're just lesser human beings, right? They're faulty, undeveloped, mentally feeble, emotionally vulnerable human beings, which is much less than being a lesser person already. Now, this is what you understand. This is the bad side of the 18th century, the bad side of Enlightenment, the one that drives away from actual science, from actual, also very interesting sort of, you can argue, proto-anthropological surveys about, everything is mixed with bad things, but the same encyclopedia with all its sort of deviances was still at least a great work of research to an extent. Hadn't it been just for the sake of categorism, which we acquired in this post-Linnean context, it also did bring some extensive knowledge on the table. Unfortunately, it's not just by providing people with knowledge that simply makes them intelligent, right? You must work in order to choose little aspect missing in between. The dialogue between Pasha Tughtan and the philosopher gardener Karpos envisions benevolent ruler respecting religious and human rights, reflecting Enlightenment ideals of just governance, etc. Similarly, Montesquieu's Persian letters of 1721 employed Persian governance to critique European despotism. Well, yeah, because everybody knows that 18th century Persia was a liberal place that the terrible Western Europeans did not match by civic rights and representation and more. But again, that's how much you can mentally prostitute yourself to the level of ridiculous. And indeed, this was not even about Persia. This was the idea of Persia, at least mediated or at least drawing parallels with the Ottoman administrative practice in comparison. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's Nathan the Wise, 1779, aside from the Jewish connection, also rediscovered, at least this is interesting for us in a medieval sense, and elevated Saladin's chivalric legend. That was already a thing, right? Rooted, for example, in medieval chronicles like Boccaccio's Decameron. However, at this point in the 18th century, presenting Islam as a sort of moral counterpoint to Christian dogmatism. So, again, screwing up again the entire equation, aligning with broader debates on comparative religion sparked by thinkers like that dirty animal of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, just to be specific. And, I have von Clausewitz's Avatar for a reason, by the way, the entire Clausewitzian theory, and the one in which the same united Germany was won in arms by strategic education, is the complete destruction of Rousseau's disgusting communism. That guy was mentally disturbed in ways you don't want to even understand. But of course, his social contract of 1762 was the base for much of these, ridiculous winery and parasitism that we witness in the streets nowadays. And so it's a pity, because the actual legend about Saladin, I just recently made a video about the Battle of Marjayoun, one of his victories, was not peregrine. I mean, in part, it stemmed from similar feelings, you can argue, even in the Middle Ages, in a time in which, by the way, the Crusades were kind of over, and so Europe was wondering about, what about the relation now of Christendom with Islam? What was this all been about? In times in which still Crusades were technically underway, like just the Ottoman was lost, but the fight did continue. And this is in part what I want to get to with this video in this regard. And there are examples that this was done by, I don't know, Catalan chroniclers still with Emmanuel Comnenus, Byzantine emperor, still 1 century after his death and the disintegration, by the way, of the Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade. In a sense, the East becomes not much a moral paradigm, but a sort of rhetorical straw man that it can be used because it's distant, nobody really knows what it is, and so you can actually avoid to actually realize how filthy it is at the end of the day. And again, I can be very straightforward in this, meaning, like, it's not like 18th century Europe by our standards of hygiene today was not filthy, but I really mean it, of course, as you understand, in a broader moral sense, but in relation to what the West really was at the time compared to this to these countries. This intellectual engagement was complemented by literal exchanges as well, notably Antoine Galland's translation of the Thousand of One Nights. At least, it's a classic. It's the same years of Peterwardein, because the publications, or at least the translation, occurred between 1704 and 17. This captivated European readers and influenced literary forms from fairy tales to Gothic novels, by the way. And I'd never liked that kind of weird exoticization of history. I really, again, my part of Europe doesn't quite indulge much in it per se. Even though there was there, of course, an absolute understanding of the Turk, for example, and the threats that was posed by that, etc., but still emanating from a culture that had by far surpassed the threat as well. So the tale's blend of exoticism and moral complexity resonated with Enlightenment ideals, how varied they actually were, further humanizing the Ottoman world, in a sense. Artistically, we mentioned it before, this fascination manifested in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's compositions, such as the Piano Sonata No. 11, Concert 331, with its lively Turkish march that everybody knows, Così fan tutte, with its playful pseudo-Turkish disguises of Ferrando and Guglielmo, and Die Entführung aus dem Serail, which revitalized the Türken opera genre. And these are all very famous. I mean, unfortunately, I discovered on YouTube that people know more about the actual historical Mozart through, the beautiful movie Amadeus, but still, just having their entire notion of the guy, of his music, and the general context from the movie. And that's why I also make videos of this kind. Now, what's the point here? It is that these works portray Turks as relatable, even endearing figures, reflecting the Mediterranean's role as a cultural bridge, which aligns with ideas that, unsurprisingly, were recovered in a more structuralistic, left-leaning historiography in the 20th century. Think about Fernand Braudel. The Turkish musical motives, characterized by percussive rhythms and exotic scales, that were an actual thing military wise. We also made multiple videos about Islamic military music, and especially probably the Ottoman military band, existing very well documented since the late Middle Ages, and indeed being at the root of the development of today's most Western military musical instruments. Right, that's absolutely true, and so there is indeed a very heavy Ottoman influence in all this, and this doesn't stop to music or this, but I don't know, Central European princes sort of competed with one another to give each other with the most magnificent Turkish panoplies, created by their own, not just stolen, say, won in the battle against the infidels. And these motives evoked both allure and familiarity, aligning with the era's growing cultural curiosity. Again, some more widespread social interest towards things that, however, had been precluded to them up to that point, so obviously giving rise to such distortions. Well, next to this, as I was brutally pointing out at the beginning of the video, the crusading chivalric ethos persisted. This deeply embedded in the military education of European nobility. That is out there for a reason, by the way. Particularly in the Habsburgic Empire, where campaigns against the Ottomans were celebrated as tests of valor. Right. I will avoid to digress here on the entire context of the Turkish wars and what the Ottomans had represented for the Austrians, and in general, like the Holy Roman Empire, for most of Middle Europa, for Poland, for the Italian states, and of course for all the populations that had been caught in between, like in the frontier. Think about the Serbians, the Hungarians, the Vlachs. The struggle between these forces had definitely defined the entire region. And again, it seems to me that most of these topics are not properly discussed. There is some sense of iconic celebration, naturally, for certain commanders, certain battles, certain features, but when it takes to actually look at in a more serious way, the actual context of these years, the people, the values, and so for especially a largely culturally dominant Anglo-American background, how actually different the values of these Europeans that are as Europeans as they can get differed, in fact, not just from today's alleged made up, I don't know even how to claim them, like how people think history in this sense, but also the ones of other Europeans of the era that, as we just explained, also were starting to think after all. And this, as we've seen, we mentioned Mozart, and so this encompassed the same Austrians. So anybody from that degree really not really care, had really began to forget, or had never really fully understood what the entire point was about, which you can't claim is the entire problem of humanity regarding knowledge, regarding past, regarding the mores, right? Today we therefore will skip some of the more brutal and also the more concrete political and strategic aspects of this very long confrontation between Christianity and Islam in the Mediterranean, remembering that these clashes, to us, mostly sound like the Saracens during the High Middle Ages, but again, this stuff continued well into the 18th century and beyond, in a sense. You can argue that there is some of it today as well, even though in a very different context that sort of surpassed many different layers of that traditional context. But this is just for saying this is Europe. This is what Europe also was at some point, meaning that all this complication was already present in the 18th century. And so you would just mention a bunch of authors, random authors, whose work you understand is continuously studied and deepened and whatever. So there is really so much yet to dig out of this. History is not being settled, definitely, and I hope the Schwerpunkt can help sensitizing regarding the right sort of attemptively objective way of framing the picture. The aforementioned martial tradition that still sprang out of the most straightforward imperial Catholic ideas is vividly captured by a source that today we will read from the Count Stefano Orselli, written from the battlefield of Peterwardein itself. Right, this decisive Christian victory symbolized both the decline of the Ottoman military dominance and the enduring allure of crusading ideals. Right, we will learn later who Stefano Orselli was, right? But it's important to point out that, of course, we're discussing a Holy Roman Imperial context, right? This guy was from Lucca, Tuscany, and he was part of those Italian, but you could say in that sense also German, Slavic, Hungarian, Polish nobility that, as I understand, even not in this case because this is within the Holy Roman Empire, but also in worlds that in a sense had been still encompassed by this broader system, that went fighting at the beginning of the 18th century. It's not really a long time ago. My earliest known ancestor was living in these years, and it would have been incredibly interesting to know what he would have thought about this all, as much as what he would have thought about Schwerpunkt, of course. But let's make him rest in peace. In a context that simply brought this young men to risk their life for prestige, for honor, for career, for promotion within what was still literally understood as the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Catholic, Apostolic, Roman Empire. All these words have a very specific meaning, right? This empire existed officially, formally, internationally, institutionally, all right? There were specific figureheads, a dynasty, kingdoms, the empire, an administration, a shared culture. Hell, I even work with sources that still have not received an adequate let's say edition in beyond these years, that are the roots of mediavistics that really were dedicated to Charles VI, to Maria Theresia. So we're looking at a word that is strikingly close, familiar to us. Obviously enough, I come largely from not only like an imperial, of course, subject background at the time, and it's not much this that, of course, captures my attention. It's rather the fact that this was really believed to be the traditional empire, right? The true meaning of Catholicism as understood even before the Christian one, that most people today do not even literally know anymore what it meant. Like, just imagine you had told people at the time, they would have probably killed you, and they would have been difficultly criticizable at that point if they had known what this word really is. Like, immediately, hammer and stake, holy water, let's kill the monster immediately, right? So let's read what this veteran, the Count Stefano Orselli from Lucca, Kingdom of Italy, Holy Roman Empire, what he wrote us. Naturally, who was in command at the Battle of Peterwardein, right? Or do we need to, cut another head, and burn the remains, just like Dracula, to be sure that we don't have these people walking on God's given earth again. Obviously, we're talking about Prince Eugen that we mentioned at the beginning. So I will simply read, and then I will stop commenting every once in a while. I will bother you a bit in this way. So, from the encampment near Peterwardein. Now, this is naturally translated from Italian, actually. Peterwardein, August the 8th, 1716. My dearest brother, Orselli writes to his brother at home, thanks be to God, we have triumphed over the Turkish forces, and both I and our nephew Lelio have emerged unharmed. After crossing the Sava with an army exceeding 160,000 combatants, equipped with over 200 artillery pieces, mortars, bombs, carcasses, bullets, and a vast array of munitions, along with thousands of wagons filled with diverse supplies, the Grand Vizier advanced towards Salenkamen, and then Karlovitz. On the 2nd, a portion of our troops was forced to retreat in some disarray. We lost approximately 500 men that day, though the enemy's losses were significantly greater. The next day, the Turkish army moved to within an hour of Peterwardein, establishing their camp on a strategically advantageous mountain. That same day, the Janissaries, supported by their cavalry, positioned themselves near the Peterwardein fortress, directly facing our infantry, which was encamped with fortifications before the said stronghold. Observing the boldness of the Turks, Prince Eugene directed the infantry to promptly construct an additional entrenchment ahead of the existing one in a highly favorable position. During this period, the exchange of fire from both sides was so fierce that numerous casualties were sustained. Throughout that day and night, both forces worked to reinforce their positions, with the enemy steadily advancing towards our entrenchment, erecting batteries and launching bombs. On the fort, Prince Eugene convened a war council with the most senior generals, deciding to mobilize all corps stationed in the vicinity of this battlefield. A general order was issued instructing all troops to secure 2 days' worth of bread, the cavalry to obtain 2 days' worth of fodder, and ample munitions. That night, they were to march across the Danube to assault the enemy within their own fortifications. The plan was to attack at dawn, but the enemy had demolished a mill above the bridge, which collapsed into the Danube, damaging the boats of both bridges. This necessitated a delay of over 3 hours to make repairs. Eventually, the troops began their advance, and by 2 hours after dawn, they occupied the positions assigned to the cavalry. An hour later, per the established plans, they moved toward the enemy's entrenchments. Some disorder occurred upon entry, but the cavalry, witnessing this, proceeded with remarkable discipline and courage, miraculously breaching the enemy's fortifications. They compelled the enemy to retreat and pursued them relentlessly for over an hour across various directions until reaching their camp, which, as noted, was situated on a strategic mountain encircled at its base by thousands of wagons, rendering penetration nearly impossible. The Janissaries and spies still defending the camp were also engaged by our cavalry, and after half an hour of fighting, the Grand Vizier, still present, fled with the rest. By half an hour before noon, we had secured the enemy's camp, and Prince Eugene authorized plundering. Meanwhile, the infantry, which had lagged behind, advanced towards the enemy's camp. The Turkish army, dispersed with great haste, retreated toward Belgrade. On the morning of the 6th, we learned that they had already crossed the bridge below the Sava. Our forces remained in place that day and night, and on the 6th, around midday, the cavalry, followed by the infantry, recrossed the Danube and returned to our camp to allow the exhausted troops to rest. Yesterday, we celebrated with the Te Deum accompanied by artillery salvos displaying the horse tails and all the banners. Today we rest, and it is anticipated we will stay here for a few days pending essential orders from the Viennese court. Thus far, over 150 artillery pieces, both large and small, right, had as mitkartanen groß und klein, the Prince Eugen song says. Even though it's not that battle, give it another year for that matter. If you know the dates, if you know the battle, you know what I'm talking about, of course. And so have been recovered, with more still being uncovered, as some were buried or hidden in the woods and other cast into the water. An immense quantity of bombs, bullets, grenades, thousands of wagons of provisions and other supplies, including camels, oxen, and buffalo, were found, though few horses, as the enemy had some time to withdraw. The enemy's losses remain uncertain, but it is estimated at least 11,000 men perished. On our side, the cavalry, which arguably secured the victory, sustained minimal losses. The infantry repelled twice, reportedly lost 4,000 to 5,000 men, including numerous officers and colonels. This is interesting, by the way, because it tells you how in this sort of more open frontier Danubian Valley context, cavalry was important. And against, of course, an army like the Ottoman one that, as we described in our numerous videos about the Ottoman forces, in fact, of the period had pretty strong consistence of at least light cavalry, but there were the Sipais as well, the feudal knights, right, of the Ottomans. 7 generals were either wounded or killed, and I will provide a detailed list in the next regular post. Due to time constraints, I cannot offer further details now, but I will do so if feasible. The plunder was of modest value as the enemy sent away their finest goods. We found tents, rice, coffee, and adequate provisions. I acquired 4 tents, and Captain Lelio secured 2, though they are of little worth. This is minor, but I must share that I had the fortune to distinguish myself with the regiment on this occasion. Right? This is, it's interesting that, of course, he considered this minor because it's about him. In the bigger picture, of course, it's minor. It says, by advancing and halting our fleeing infantry, I simultaneously held back the enemy, who were already slaughtering our men. So imagine the context. So this guy basically went against an enemy who was triumphantly advancing. And you know that the situation there is difficult because you may break. That this, of course, mostly was happening with cavalry, but not only, as we will see now. And so he manages to, in part, stop the fugitives, so giving further, sort of making them coming back to fight, and also managing to halt the enemy. It says, then moving ahead of the infantry, I managed to repel the Janissaries and drive them from our entrenchment, pursuing them until the regiments stationed on the flanks began to advance, prompting the enemy's flight. This is quite important again because it's even more counter-directional here. The enemy is advancing. You manage to push him back in the process. You're not yet supported on the flanks by the rest of the troop. It says, my fortune was that His Serene Highness the Prince witnessed this action, and I now enjoy its rewards. When we were stationed in the enemy's camp, all officers visited Prince Eugene, who was under the abandoned tent of the Grand Vizier, to offer congratulations on the victory achieved. Just imagine the scene, to be there, right? Upon arrival, I encountered the generals, who congratulated me, having heard from His Serene Highness the praise bestowed upon me and the regiment. I then approached His Highness, who spoke to me directly, saying, I commend you for the splendid action you and your regiment performed before my eyes, and I can assure you that this action was among the most significant contributions to the victory secured. Just receiving these words from Prince Eugene, you can pass away happily. You can well imagine the joy in my heart. I promptly left and shared this news with all the officers of our regiment, who were greatly heartened. So he basically saved like an important section of the line. And I can say I emerged from this action miraculously, for in all my years of service I've never faced such peril or such an unrelenting barrage of fire, yet thanks to God neither I nor my horse was armed. Again, von Clausewitz, some 100 years later, tells us what it means to approach that fire. The psychological situation of literally playing the Russian roulette, all right? And you can see all around the devastation. So it's you there. Think about it. Captain Lelio conducted himself admirably and sends his greetings to all at home. Letter from Count Stefano Orselli of Lucca. So this is really remarkable. I think the letter by itself really encapsulates the magnificence of the moral dimension of a victory of this kind from a literal protagonist who fought and won this from the field and that received the congratulations of the same Prince Eugene in the process, which is something that, again, I think all of us would like to receive, for especially like what that practically means, that we would have been able to achieve, right? This is difficult to explain in terms that can render the full picture of a battle like Peterwardein and all the tactical implications of the same. there's no doubt that the description, by the way, provided by Orselli is very much consistent with the dynamic of clashes of the time. If you read some Prince Eugene's, I actually want to make a video on predispositions before the battle. For example, the one before the one of Turin is quite important. There, the Prussians were looking at, and that will have some influence on the army of Frederick the Great, by the way. And so there is this incredible need for support, combined armed tactics, maintaining the line, not creating disorder before the attack. So that there is something really mainly about withstanding the enemy fire, advancing, as we've seen here, against fortified positions, by the way, such as even the Laga that the Ottomans would establish. And the ultimate glory, by the way, of entering just the vizier's tent, presided over by Prince Eugene, all the generals of the imperial army. In this context, where again, imagine the war itself. Here we're just telling the story because it's just like the cinematic cut you can find on YouTube, movie clips, etc. But it's having gotten there. It's not much, of course, like the engagement per se, but what this meant strategically and politically. Why were these guys receiving orders from Vienna? Why were the Ottomans there? This is something, again, today we will not look at because we're not making, paradoxically, a video about the battle as we would do it in other videos. And again, I plan really to accelerate from that point of view. But the motivation, the sense, again, the nobility, the risking your own life, performing your own duty, being praised by one of the greatest commanders of the modern era that has literally seen the action you led unfolding before his eyes, is something incredibly, in fact, apostolic in the actual messenger mean of the Holy Ghost and how the Imperium manifested physically and metaphysically at Peterwardein. The losses, as you understood here, are also pretty heavy, but the Ottomans, of course, had the worst of it from this famous debacle. Now, what is the cherry on top that I decided? Well, I spoiled it, I think, in the title. I don't know yet because I haven't chosen it yet, but you know before you arrive to this point. It's the aforementioned, if you remember what Orselli wrote in the letter regarding the spoils of war. So not just the cannons, the animals, some part of an animal that is more like indeed an insignia. I haven't made a video about this, but I'm going to, and very often we talk about this in the videos about Turco-Mongol warfare. The tugh, the horse tail. And the horse tail from Peterwardein that Orselli is describing is displayed, according to you, where? In Lucca's cathedral. Beside the chapel of the Holy Face stands as a relic of. There were many tughs, of course. This is the one that Orselli brought back from the Danube, as a relic of both martial triumph and, in some ways, the fading crusading era, if anything, because the Ottomans were being basically beaten back. Then, as you know, there are issues because it's not like, unfortunately, Prince Eugene's victories were supported enough by the Habsburgs in the end to really secure all the lands that at some point the Imperials took over in Central Europe, in the Danube, in the Balkans. And we will talk about this more comprehensively, looking at the veritable campaigns of, in fact, of Prince Eugene. But the horse tail, the tugh from Peterwardein that you can literally see if you visit Lucca, it is, such a very famous city for many reasons. We know it better for medieval history, but it has, by the way, beautiful Renaissance fortifications. It's also a musical city, as you know. Because of Puccini, you have the arena mark of the ancient Roman city, just in one of the most important squares of the city. It's a treasure. That the early medieval Lucca's archives are literally by far one of the richest sources of the era, right? Because those archives were preserved literally from Longobards times. So you imagine this in this context in the 18th century, which we tend to forget. In fact, for these places, well, we'll have more coming on the Grand Duchy of Tuscany that we haven't really talked much of anything at all, if I'm not wrong. Even though this is very important, Lucca was a principality on its own. It was a republic since the Middle Ages and had managed to remain formally independent from the Medici at this point, but still they were basically dominated by the edge of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, led by noblemen that served the empire, again, in the 18th century, and that could bring back from, you can argue, the bowels of the steppes. Naturally, tughs were produced, let's say, by the Ottomans also in Europe, right? But who were the Ottomans here? Like, there were lots of Tatars, there were people coming, I don't know, from the horses themselves may have come from very far away, etc. This horse tail and stuff, imagine the horse that I had, if you had known that, is literally displayed as a spolia opima in the cathedral, next again to the Holy Face. And this is, I think, one of the most beautiful relics, literally, of this era. If you visit Baroque churches across the West, you often do find, especially of course, in the Catholic world, you do find an incredible amount of military references. Also architectonic ones, decorative ones, etc. We talked about this in the video, but I don't remember which one it was, but it was the one about the Virgin of Vienna, that is, in fact, very much connected with this whole entanglement here. But just know, if you happen to visit, look at that, you can find that there, and so you can see it. It's striking, if you think about it, but so it is. It reflects the complex interplay of military glory and cultural curiosity, in a sense, as European victories like Peterwardein coincided with this also growing sort of sense of command over the Ottomans themselves. As we were remembering before, the 1718 Treaty of Passarowitz not only secured territorial gains for the Habsburgs after Belgrade, after some striking victories of Prince Eugene, but also fostered cultural exchanges with Ottoman diplomats and merchants becoming more familiar and less threatening figures in cities like Vienna and Venice. The aforementioned song of Prince Eugene literally stems from this crowning achievement, by the way, all won in blood. And these magnificent battles that must have been just an incredible spectacle to witness, right? The sheer beauty, right, of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, right? The trumpets and the drums, the war cries and the lamentations of the dying, that all mixed with cannon shots, musketry, it must have been incredible. And you would have seen, in fact, these very relics of medieval warfare, because there would be some literal steppe peoples that had not really changed an inch from the ones you would see from, 300 years before. And this is what we must also consider. Right, 300 years before, there was the Battle of Ankara, Timur the Lame against the Ottoman Turks in Anatolia, so not even radically overly distant from these places, when the Ottomans already controlled Romania, by the way. So here, crossing the Danube, you are into it. Think about that. It's impressive. This is what men at the time fought and died for. Unfortunately, I usually don't finish with this sort of negative note, but I must say that scholarship, like if you were to simply ask, even AI, I presume, today, right? You tell them, but why don't you talk to me about what the relation between the Ottomans, these people, like, of course, if you are specific, you ask, tell me about this very, Battle of Peterwardein, or never tried to get sort of the same references, because I don't think it's wired to literature at this point. But if, let's say, a kid asked for even something relatively medium advanced, for, say, what was happening at the time, they would tell you things, again, about the aforementioned intellectual curiosity for the West, right? The Enlightenment that was informed by the book, the Ottoman manuscripts preserved in I would not say the name, Constantinople libraries, because the study of Islamic philosophy, people still believe in this stuff. It's like for the Renaissance, for humanism, when actual Byzantinists tell us that it's all a pile of bleep, whatever, why do we have to keep babbling about this? Again, this is not saying, the Ottomans didn't have libraries, they weren't interesting, they weren't influential to some extent. But let's say in the bigger picture, like, this relation has always to be about, the intellectual curiosity and then the socio-economical exchange. Well, is it possible? Really? Right? The entire question is challenging Ottoman barbarism as the single first concern of today's history. It's really ridiculous. Together with the idea of religious pluralism, also many parts of Europe were sort of religiously pluralistic historically, in the sense that, still in Christian times there were Muslims living in Spain and Sicily, right? The Jews were pretty much all over medieval Europe. So imagine somebody had, how is that sort of, why should, the Ottomans be considered just some sort of, first prize winners for the fact that, being obviously a universal empire, having to rule over many different peoples, they ended up being multi-ethnic and multicultural. It's not tolerance, first of all. It is true indeed that in the 17th even century, if you look at John Locke, even in letter concerning toleration, there are references in general to the sense that the Ottomans themselves had this more decentralized government. Of course it's a decentralized government. How do you think you control Sudan or Ukraine from Constantinople, right? There is no way to do it in a different way. So the question is rather more complicated, right? What does this actually mean from sources like, for example, during religious conflicts post-Reformation, that, by the way, at this point were being bypassed. Most Catholic France had been quite glad to help the Ottomans against the Habsburgs for that matter. And as we've seen, like, Protestant Germans themselves didn't actually give a damn about Christianity by supporting the Turks, as long as the papacy and the Habsburgs, the emperor, did not win. This is real, right? This is not some anecdotal rhetoric that we sort of come up with every once in a while. This is literally Voltaire describing the violences of the Catholics during the English Civil War, this terrible, again, authoritarianism, whatever, and skipping, the massacre of Drogheda by Cromwell. I can't say I make Catholic history, because I make history, and that is inherently Catholic. If you know what Catholic means, I don't need to say anything wrong or distorted or whatever. I must confess, I like Cromwell, a historical figure. And you see, for example, I discovered that in the Anglosphere, Cromwell is considered like some sort of Hitler or some dictatorial monster that tried to, mostly because he tried to take over. So there's this obsession towards the tyrant. So in many ways, it's even more jarring to think that the Ottomans would be considered as some example of sort of liberalism or tolerance or more enlightened government. In fact, by peoples that were so hypocritical about the fact that, again, they had basically destroyed a church, they had destroyed a monarchy, and indeed, like, they were able to succeed. I highly admire the British. I highly admire the British Empire. I don't have anything against that in particular, aside from the temper of the times, and indeed how this, say, the disgregation of the traditional Christian unity had occurred, etc. But that's something you can separate from certain merits. but certain judgments. And again, I don't even have anything against the Ottomans per se, right? Again, great foe. It's great that there were the Turkish wars in the sense that at least that we could have done without them, but say, and in many ways, literally taking out the Ottomans up to a very few decades prior to the fall of Constantinople. I am not kidding. It's literally like the Hospitaliers, the Venetians could do it, could unplug the Ottoman lifeline there, but they wouldn't. Also because in the time, you got to understand them. There was, in fact, no certainty regarding what would have actually happened later, just like we don't have it today, so we can't really blame them per se. But I mean, the fact that the Turkish wars happened is something that we should celebrate as a test of our civilization, as for the chance that this was for it that came from the Ottoman power itself. So it can't simply be bypassed or misunderstood, right? And so you can talk about the Ottoman court's patronage of poetry, calligraphy, and miniature painting, described in European travel accounts as allegedly, at that point, not anymore, but were rivaling Renaissance art, further elevating its cultural prestige. But how the random guy in Palestine would leave, actually, frankly, it's something completely different. And so, regardless of all those people that, spam on Facebook now, sponsored posts, look at how these Palestinians looked before the terrible things happening in the 20th century. Yeah, because that was notoriously such an advanced culture, so such a beautiful place where to live. Yeah, such a quiet place or whatever. And indeed, like it's not because of the changes that occurred that, by the way, some of those people decided that they didn't want peace for themselves, for that matter. In any case, the sense of all this Enlightenment aspirations somehow struggle to reconcile with a crusading, you can say, past. Because it's true that by Mozart's time, let's say, we are starting to look at at Europe in some more bourgeois living room fashion. But indeed, the same values that have permeated the previous generation, the same ancient regime that was still alive, by the way, at that point, would kept being alive, in spite of, what happened in the following decades and so on, is again so close. We start having photos of people that were born at this time, still alive. And so the question is, again, is it possible this is so forgotten? Is it possible that the crusading key is still alive in the glory of Prince Eugene at the early 18th century Habsburgic victories over the Turks, the expansion? How do you think the Austrian Empire came into being? Because this is the moment in which Austria actually became a big power. Like before, it wasn't much of a thing. Yes, in the first half of the 16th century, regionally wise, that it didn't hit. But let's say the Austrian Empire that we know, aside from its gradual dismantlement up to the, or at least weakening, because territorially it was immense up to the First World War, is the same one we see here, where people who lived in there, right? It's not much. Yes, in this case, for example, like the Tuscany didn't much have to do with the Habsburgs, even though they ruled from there. It wasn't anymore much of a possession, if not for the fact that it was a Holy Roman Imperial place. But again, after the dismantlement, the secularization of the same empire, certain pieces were lost. Indeed, a new mentality occurred that the poor Count Orselli would have been terrified by if he had seen 100 years forward. In part, you can argue the same sort of enlightened absolute regimes, which is also a pretty strange way of defining something. It wasn't absolutistic at all. They wished they had been absolutistic, but it would, paradoxically, the nation state would succeed in an institutional and legal way to be absolute, fully centralized, at least by law, by foundation. Not even that can control even historical narratives, as we see here. But speaking of the same, the Austrians, but speaking, as we said before, about the Croatians, the Magyars, the Italians that remained until the same World War One there, the Vlachs, the Ruthenians, well, the Czechs, what can we say about them? Right, these people lived up to literally 100 years ago, or almost, into realities that were, in any case, even later, heavily informed by that past. And even the way we tell 21st century history is somehow weird, because it seems as if we were just entering our own phase, and so as if this was detached from the prior history, meaning our own as for the standards that we have today. And before, it was just something else that had to bring to this at some point. You can make this could spark an interesting debate in historical philosophy regarding, what could have been. Like, could tradition, could the ancien regime, could a certain way to power be salvaged, be sort of maintained up to later times in history? It's very difficult to make such arguments in, again, as much as the what ifs I do not like. But more than else, the general sense that there is some broader disconnection prognosticated regarding the past. Something was clear to many people before this time, and that in fact promptly occurred, promptly materialized. We can't simply turn our heads and say, well, we don't know what you're talking about. The contrast between the views that we in fact still oddly have today, tendentially speaking, as described at the beginning of the video, and the more concrete fact that we are fighting a war, essentially, for civilization, is revealing, because it shows you how both things can exist at the same time. What I normally say, that modernity does not quite exist unless you want to pretend something, right? That does not, right? Everything that works exclusively by tradition, by divine power. And if you nail that, good, you will have that power yourself. If you don't, you'll keep just degenerating down a hole, and you're going to remain stuck into that. And so if you have claustrophobic nightmares that can comparatively tell you what it really feels like from an existential point of view, to realize that the condition, the situation, and how much there is a way to understand further. Because the reason why people fight and die today is not different, let's say, in a fundamental existential sense compared to what they did at the time, right? And it seems pretty obvious that most of this weird worldview that sort of poses itself as a concealing layer over reality that most people simply decide to live in on a regular basis is just a voluntary measure to basically hide from, to basically castigate a specific worldview that was the traditional one, and in this sense, the one that challenges everything about somebody's life. Like tradition challenges you to everything. So it's not a surprise that people who don't want to be challenged made up a narrative that doesn't hold, that is unnecessary, and that is somehow just apodictic, for the sake of itself, for the sake of distracting from the real reality and making people ever less high standard, essentially, in nature, which is instead what noblemen, as we've seen, strived to be, in order to, by achieving actual results. This is not part of some sort of random win or lose. There is a specific path that Western civilization succeeded in that is truly revealed through these battles. It can't thus be equivocated or forgotten or silenced. And again, it's so weird. If I remember years ago when I started more or less this series about, let's say, 17th century warfare, mostly revolving around the siege of Vienna, the Battle of Vienna. I was watching some sites that were run. I mean, some sites, maybe one that impressed me. I have this memory of a guy who said, the Battle of Vienna 1683 is instrumentalized by the far right to foster, I don't remember even what was the bottom line, because they don't even know it themselves. It was just like more a plain accusation. That's normally how it works. It's never like a historical critique. It's just like, these guys are bad because they are interpreting the Battle of Vienna as a clash between, say, Christianity and Islam, at in that context, the Habsburgic Ottoman Wars. Again, you can criticize the definition to some extent, but can you eliminate the reality that it actually was something of that kind? And why would it be bad to profile the battle in that way? I mean, there is no doubt that there are some self-styled right-wingers that are more like, people with no education and whatsoever. They do not absolutely know what tradition is, because again, like most people, they absolutely have never heard even what it's supposed to be to begin with. They think that nationalism is tradition. That's where they stop, literally, and they don't technically even understand what nationalism is. But aside from that, there is also some age component normally to this movement. That unfortunately end up, in fact, not challenging the best elements extrapolated from this garbage in general into something like more primarily correct about even the traditional idea of nation, but they end up being timidly conservative workers, in their middle-aged life that don't want to say anything more violent or any more violent or dangerous, whatever, because they have become cowardly. They always end up in the same way. Just like communists are already just, not proletarians even anymore. They own more, and they own and they will own more when they will be middle-aged, at least not too much, fortunately, but still in ways that they will defend their capital, so to say. But even so, again, let's leave aside this manipulation, but what's wrong with, for example, any other person that would be instead by the same people labeled as a sort of some far right-wing extremists, whatever that's supposed to mean, in practice, because as I do, for example, and I don't mind being called whatever, I think that if you say something wrong about a person, definitionally, it's just going to backfire. Because I want to rediscover, for example, the true meaning that these people gave to the event. And you see that the dedication, let's say, of this topic just to some sort of weird cultural connection outlook, but there wasn't just war, there were also other and so? Right, so that the reality is a chapter separated from one another. Like there is warfare from one side, and then there was trade. Just a structuralist would reason in this way. We all know why and how, ideologically speaking, to distract from reality, as we explained before, and to eliminate standards. Of course, it should be. The war should be even more important, exactly because there were those other connections. It's as if these connections were used to dilute the aspect of war, of tradition, of authority, of hierarchy, of power, of beauty, of valor, of glory, of victory, and we all know again why. Because if somebody succeeds along that line, it becomes dangerous for the others, at least in the others' perspective, in their cowardice, really. So there is all a traditional ideology countered for mostly psychological reasons as opposed to any real explanation of the picture. And we can also say that indeed we have the same conservatives have lost this kind of narrative, this kind of rhetoric, right? To them, it's like instead triggering the leftists who wrote that article by still, making their own rhetoric about, I don't know, anti-immigration is fine. But this rhetoric will not work if you don't clothe it with historical knowledge. If you don't really expound why it is an issue that, for example, an uncontrolled migration policy is going to destroy the social-cultural fabric of the best places in the world that are likely going to remain of the similar moral, or at least they're going to be flatter. At some point, there is the risk they're going to be surpassed, but let's not say go too far. It's likely going to be something like that, but it's even more straightforwardly, obviously, the everyday consequences of this, the costs, the uselessness, the hypocrisy, the ridiculous lack of any morals or any standards. So in general, and we're talking higher cultural standards, because these people have also convinced the masses that, the only way to make culture, the humanities, is to be a leftist. And there are lots of conservatives that, since are ignorant as goats, because they don't really, contrary to what they've been told, just you belong to a nation, so you're valid. They come from lesser people's household with zero schooling, zero culture, zero identity. The schools suck, the universities suck, the same church sucked, everything sucks because humanity has collapsed, a very bad standard. And so the most obvious question is, they're going to follow along. They're actually becoming leftists themselves. They don't know that. Most nationalists are just a bunch of socialists, and they have absolutely no idea of what this even means. Actually, the two things always exist in parallel, because the opposite of nationalism is not socialism. The opposite of nationalism is the traditional meaning of the nation, and the traditional meaning of society. Hence, nationalism and socialism not only go in pair most of the time, but are also the most sort of the deterioration of these kind of concepts, because they cannot be separated either from one another. Only if you alienate from reality. And this is also the thing, right? Fixating with some random deformity just because of the minimal implication that it may have, because of your own temporary inclination. It's the worthlessness of the same concept, ever more diverging from the only one unitary vision of God, right? And the truth, obviously enough. So, this was, let's say, one reflection on this all, because we, I think, can't make good use of such understanding, both in studying history, military history. That's what I said also in the article that I was discussing at the beginning of the video. As far as that publication was concerned, it was talking what is that we mean by modern warfare? Why do we study modern warfare? What's the point of it? The history of technology, of how armies evolved for today's standards, or a specific national perspective? Hell no. It's about God. It's about tradition. It's about Catholicism. It's about the universal empire. And that's why you cannot understand today's world if you don't understand, while visiting the cathedral of Lucca, you will find an Ottoman tugh brought by Holy Roman Imperial noblemen from the battlefield of Peterwardein after Prince Eugene in person had congratulated him for having carried out a heroic action in the midst of that such important battle, where the Ottomans were crushed, by the way, and the empire was elevated to unprecedented heights. in that Habsburgic leadership. So that's the meaning of why we study history. All right. If you don't get it, it's going to be a bit difficult to go ahead in any other path. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.